This year, we mark the 104th anniversary of the establishment of the Korean Provisional Government in Shanghai during Japan's colonial rule of Korea. So what led to the establishment of the Korean Provisional Government beyond national borders? How did ethnic Koreans in Hawaii support Korea's fight for independence? And what are the implications of Seoul's campaign to seek out Korea's independence fighters? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we take a short walk into Korea's history and its fight for independence, as April 11th marks the anniversary of the Korean Provisional Government that was set up in Shanghai back in the year 1919. For more, I have Professor Emeritus Edward Shultz, who is also the head of the Korea American Foundation over in Hawaii. Professor Shultz, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Pleasure.
Right, here in the studio I also have Kwon Soa. As always, Soa, welcome back.
Hello, Sunny.
Right, so let's start with some background information regarding the establishment of the Korean Provisional Government in Shanghai in the year 1919.
Yes, so the Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea was established on April 11th, 1919, just shortly after the March 1st movement in the same year in response to Japan's colonial rule of the Korean peninsula. Now, more people might be familiar with 3.1절 or the March 1st movement, day where the proclamation of independence was made by a group of 33 leaders in Seoul, and that led to nationwide uprisings. Not only within the country, but the presence of freedom fighters grew overseas as well, such as in China, Russia, and the US, with the realization that there were limitations to what protesters could do in Korea amid Japan's brutal crackdowns. It was also outside the country, in Shanghai, China, where the Korean Provisional Government was established, which became the center of resistance against Japan's suppression from its establishment, as I said, in April 1919 until August 1945, when Korea was liberated and the Provisional Government was dissolved. Leading members of the Korean Provisional Government included Lee Seung-man, who later became the first president of the Republic of Korea, An Chang-ho, and Kim Gu. Now, the Provisional Government introduced a presidential system and three branches of the government: the legislative, administrative, and judicial branches. The government in exile, how it is often referred to as, although some historians say it shouldn't be called that way, introduced the first democratic republic in the history of Korea from what in the past was monarchies, and it played a pivotal role in shaping modern Korea. The official name, Republic of Korea, also stemmed from the Provisional Government, and what Articles 1 and 2 of the Republic of Korea's Constitution says today, that the Republic of Korea's sovereignty lies with the people and all authority comes from the people, are all present in the Provisional Government's Constitution, written more than 100 years ago.
Right. Also, so prior to the year 2019, we commemorated this particular day on April 13th. Could you explain this change in date for us?
Right. The foundation date of the Provisional Government was designated as April 13th back in 1989 and was commemorated on that day until year 2018, which was the 99th anniversary. However, historians have been suggesting the correction of the date following years of collective research that found the actual foundation of the Korean Provisional Government falls on April 11th. When the Provisional Charter was enacted. This is a happening that occurred due to the existence of different sources of documents, with the accuracy of some of them not deemed reliable, according to experts. So after sufficient evidence was found, the government decided to adjust the foundation date to April 11th, 1919, and with that, in year 2019, marking the 100th anniversary, it was held on the 11th for the first time.
Right, I see. And now, Professor Shultz, what can you tell us about the ethnic Koreans there in Hawaii who sought to support the fight for Korea's independence?
The Koreans first came to Hawaii in 1903, and this is just before the Japanese took over Korea. And the immigration lasted from 1903 to 1905, and when the Japanese took over, they then basically shut down any more Korean immigration. All in all, roughly 7,000 Koreans immigrated from Korea to Hawaii And this is over the period from roughly 1903 to 1920. And at that time, basically 90% of Koreans in the United States were living in Hawaii. And when they came, initially it was just men, or overwhelmingly men. And then as time progressed, they started what they call the picture brides. And these are women who sent their pictures over and then came to join and get married to men here in Hawaii. And what all of these people are doing is often they were living on plantations, and they had very hard labor. It was out hot in the sun, and many of them were initially from fairly urban backgrounds, and so they really weren't paid as farmers, but they quickly adjusted themselves to living on the farms. And they also became very, very much aware of Korea's loss of sovereignty. And everybody, as Korean immigrants came, every year they would have news stories of woe of what's happened to Korea. And then, of course, in 1910, Korea was extinguished. And yet, all of them carried a great love for their country and a great desire to try to reestablish Korea's independence. And this became very much a product of life in Hawaii from basically 1903 up until the end of the Korean War and end of the World War II in 1945. So living in a pressure cooker, working hard, and yet really bitterly suffering from the loss of their country's sovereignty. They really bonded together and said, we have to do something. We have to support our country.
Right, I see. Professor Shultz, I understand your foundation itself, it's also actively engaged in a tombstone rubbing project that is facilitating the task of identifying former independence activists. Could you explain this project for us?
Sure. Every year, the Korean American Foundation holds a ceremony out at a cemetery on the North Shore. And last year, the KBFD producer, that's our local TV producer, suggested we start a tombstone rubbing in which, and there you see a picture of basically this particular cemetery in which we gathered together a number of different people, basically community people, to try to search out the tombstones of the independence fighters. And throughout the summer, they went and collected these rubbings, and essentially they gathered roughly 60 rubbings altogether of patriots. And there you see one gentleman who's doing an actual rubbing. And at the end of this project, and by the way, it was not only Jung Tae Lee from KBFD TV, but also Ducky Lee Moribayashi, who is the head of the Korean American Historical Institute, who really became the linchpins behind this particular project. Altogether, as I say, they gathered roughly 60 of these rubbings, and then we initially displayed them in Hawaii, as you can see right from that particular picture, and then we took them over to the Independence Hall in Daejeon or Cheonan, and gave these rubbings to the Independence Hall, and they're now under the custody of Independence Hall. But all in all, it was a community-wide project. It lasted the whole year of 2022 with the idea of being one more way to commemorate our 120th anniversary of Korean immigration this year, 2023.
Right, a remarkable project, if I may say so myself. And so also here in Korea, the campaign to bring home the remains of Korea's independence fighters buried abroad, that is, continues. Right, tell us a bit about that.
Right, so such efforts do continue throughout the year, but remains of independence fighters are often brought home on meaningful occasions, such as around March 1st Independence Movement Day and the anniversary of the foundation of the Korean Provisional Government. So the latest remains that returned home just yesterday or Monday are those of Korean independence fighter Hwang Ki-hwan, who died almost exactly 100 years ago in New York. His remains arrived at Incheon International Airport Monday morning, and a repatriation ceremony was held, attended by Veterans Minister Bang Min-sik and descendants of independence fighters. His remains were then laid to rest at the National Cemetery in Daejeon. Now, Sunny, I have a question for you. Have you watched Mr. Sunshine?
I actually have.
Oh, really? I
Quite a
actually
while
haven't
back.
yet. Oh, I see.
It's a
So,
beautiful drama series.
then
Everyone played the role.
exactly. Then you might be familiar that the story of Hwang Ki-hwan actually was depicted in the 2018 hit series. So, and he was known as Yoo-jin Choi in the drama. So Hwang was born in Suncheon, South Pyongan province in 1886, which is now in North Korea, and then moved to the U.S. in 1904. He fought for the U.S. in World War I, during which he was stationed in France. He then stayed in France and fought for Korea's independence. In 1921, Hwang served as a member of the Korean Provisional Government's diplomatic mission in London, and he also made numerous publications. He died at the early age of 37 of a heart disease in New York. Now, it took 10 years for the activist's remains to be returned to Korea. This, as the Suncheon-born Hwang, as I mentioned earlier, had no official family registration here. Following years of efforts, Korea now was able to give posthumous Korean nationality to the independence activist and bring him home. Korea's government is continuously seeking to repatriate heroes like Hwang by receiving approval from local governments, because many of these, because they are already buried at cemeteries there, it needs approval from the government cemeteries and also local courts as well overseas.
Right, and keeping in mind what Soa has just said, Professor Shultz, what do you believe are the broader implications of Korea's relentless campaign of seeking out its independence fighters for their descendants?
I think we have to realize the first half of the last century was really hard for Korea. They lost their sovereignty, then they had a war that divided the country, and really Korea was just surviving, just barely surviving as it lost, as I say, as it was on the verge of being taken over. And yet, Koreans didn't give up. They continued to carry the love for their country. They continued to find ways in which to support their kingdom, or their provisional government. And I think in this respect, the independence fighters are really models for all of us. All of us, when we face issues of citizenship, issues of fighting for democracy, these folks didn't give up. They continued to work on, and I think it behooves all of us to find inspiration from just ordinary people, common people. Not kings, not queens, not presidents, not senators, just ordinary citizens who took it upon themselves to try to defend what they believed was their birthright, what they believed was their country that was being seriously damaged.
Right, indeed. Selfless sacrifices by these very ordinary people. And also, these ordinary people's plight, so back in history, the U.S. media played quite a role in bringing to light the plight of these Koreans, especially also raising awareness about Japan's atrocities on the Korean peninsula. Could you briefly tell us about that?
Exactly. The U.S. and Western media covered the events of the uprisings on the Korean peninsula with a great deal of empathy and fervor. Although it took around 2 weeks for many of them to really get a grasp of the situation and start reporting on the March 1st and following events. Now, American media covered the independence movement on their headlines, be it on national or local newspapers. For instance, the New York Times on March 13th titled an article, "Koreans Declare for Independence. Thousands who engage in demonstration are arrested by the Japanese." And also a headline by the Washington Post on March 15th, 1919, said, "Girls' hands cut off. Atrocity by Japanese soldiers reported by Koreans. Seoul outbreak subsides." It described the independent movement as a national one with 3 million adherents, most of them being students, and reported on the tens of thousands arrested and tortured. And as the title says, reported on the atrocity of Japanese soldiers who cut off a girl's hand holding a copy of the Independence Manifesto in one hand. As she raised her other hand, it was cut off too. And also the Honolulu-based Pacific Commercial Advertiser, now the Honolulu Advertiser, covered the movement extensively as well, including on March 15th, carrying an article that said, "Koreans' independence movement growing. Washington hears many dead and jailed as a result of revolt, ultimate freedom from Japan sought. And later on March 20th, one article said, Koreans assert independence. Now, not only did these media abroad, like in the US, play a big role, but of course also, again, the Korean freedom fighters themselves overseas played a significant role as they were raising their awareness around the world, and they were also featured in a lot of interviews in such medias abroad.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Shultz, do tell us a bit about the campaign in Hawaii of seeking out the descendants of Korea's independence fighters and honoring them with house nameplates, I think. What was behind this particular campaign, and what has been the response from the recipients?
Well, actually, we started a whole plaque project about 10 years ago in which we tried to commemorate important historical sites here in the islands to the Korean community. The Korean community today is roughly 50,000 people, and it's not terribly large, and yet Koreans are very active in the community. And so what we decided to do, in addition to this plaque project, general plaque project, is to go to various homes and give this plaque that you see right here, a home for the descendants of Korean independence fighters. And we went to, actually on March 1st this year, we went to we picked 3 families, and we went to them, and they erected their plaques. And here you can see them. But even before, when we had our major centennial 120th anniversary on January 13th, we did find people who were descendants and gave them likewise plaques. So altogether, we've given out perhaps 30 plaques. We hope to, actually, let me correct that. We gave out 30 plaques on January 13th when we celebrated our 120th anniversary. And then we've been in the process of giving out more plaques. Altogether, we have given out roughly 70 plaques to various families. And all of them are tickled. They're very happy about it. And they also know that this is a great message for their descendants, just as they're commemorating their grandparents and their parents. Now their children will be able to have a greater appreciation for what Korean independence fighters did for their country.
Right, indeed. And staying with that campaign, so South Korea, for its part, also traced the descendants of 6 Hawaii-based independence fighters. What more can you tell us about that?
Right, Korea identified the descendants of 6 independence activists last year whose endeavors in the fight against Japan's colonial rule were made in Hawaii. The Veterans Affairs Ministry had launched a project to locate descendants of activists who contributed to the independence movement there in a bid to honor them properly with state benefits. Researches of old documents, newspaper articles, meetings with officials in Hawaii, and etc. were used in finding these. Now, among the descendants were George Blair McCune, the grandson of George S. McCune, who was an American who won the Order of Merit for a National Foundation in 1963 for contributing to the Korean independence movement. And there was also Elsa Carl, the great-granddaughter of Dora Moon. Moon took part in the first organization of Korean women in Hawaii in 1913. Willa Chung, her daughter, helped as well by raising funds along with other Korean women. And an official at the Veterans Affairs Ministry said last year, quote, the identification of the descendants carries significant meaning given that it sheds new light on Hawaii-based independence fighters who financially supported their country's independence and the activities of its provisional government.
Right. Professor Shultz, this year marks the 120th anniversary of Korean immigration to Hawaii, and I understand celebrations were held back in January to commemorate the arrival of the first ship of Koreans into the island. That being said, what is on the agenda for the rest of this year?
Well, actually, our Consul General brought us all together roughly a year ago and said, hey, we have to do some big things in 2023. That's when our 120th was. And as you mentioned, we had major commemorations on January 13th and several other dates right around that time. Now, for the rest of the year, we will continue to beat the drums and remind people that Koreans are important in Hawaii. Koreans are integral to Hawaii, and you may well know that our Lieutenant Governor is a Korean American. And that's certainly given us added prestige as a separate community. But the first big thing will be on July 25th. We go to Punch Bowl Cemetery and we commemorate the veterans who gave their life to help defend Korea during the Korean War. Then in August, mid-August, we have what we call the Korea Festival, and the Korean Chamber of Commerce becomes the major sponsor for that. And this is a day, a picnic, basically a big picnic in which we have Korean dance, we have photo shops, photo exhibits, eating contests, any number of different events occur. And then as we get into the autumn, we have Hangul Nal, celebrating Korean script on October 9th. And we also will have later in the year some golf tournaments and other sports events. And then towards the end of the year, we have a special soju drinking contest, I understand. I'm not quite sure if I'll participate in that, but there are all sorts of events throughout the year. And then, of course, when 2024 comes, we once again celebrate 121st anniversary Korean immigration to Hawaii and the United States.
Right, and the celebration continues, of course. Good to know, good to know. So back here in Korea, on a rather somber note, though, what can you share with us about the lives of some of the descendants of Korea's independence fighters?
Sunny, while while honoring their grandfathers and grandmothers' deeds, or their great-grandfather or great-grandmother's deeds, and never losing their pride for these acts, quite a number of descendants agree with the Korean saying that says 독립운동을 하면 3대가 망한다. Was basically saying if it took part in independence movements, 3 generations will end up poor. Despite the government's efforts in raising the level of recognition and support for independence fighters and their descendants, the reality is that many of them are struggling to make ends meet. According to a survey conducted by the Ministry of Patriots and Veterans Affairs in 2018, 66% of freedom fighters recognized as patriots by the ministry had no income, and among those who had jobs, only a minority had stable jobs, and also 76% had chronic illnesses. And also a dilemma is that children and grandchildren of these independence fighters are facing is that not all of their stories are known to the public. So there are high-profile independence fighters' descendants who are living decent lives, while there are also many unsung heroes that deserve the same treatment by the community and government. And according to experts, many of the freedom fighters' families are hesitating in talking about their economic situation because they are afraid that their ancestors' legacy could be dented by doing so.
I see. Well, that remains a task to be tackled by the government, I suppose. All right. Well, that is all the time we have for this edition, I believe. So, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Shultz over in Hawaii, thank you so much for your insights today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. Tomorrow, that is Wednesday, we highlight the latest events within the K-pop industry. Join us then.